October 17, 1996.
See how it looks? Bend forward, far as you can go. Does that bother you?
No. When you're ill, who knows how much treatment is enough?
They've been able to save the employer enormous amounts of money on inpatient care, on unnecessary inpatient care.
These are not medical decisions. These are strictly economic decisions.
The family is sitting there thinking, what are we going to do? And before they can even respond to it, the child is dead.
And who decides when enough is too much?
It is absolutely wreaking havoc on the mental health care system.
Tonight, the tension between managed care and mental health.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Start with this. If everyone in the country is going to have access to proper medical care, someone is going to have to set limits. Limits on the number of diagnostic tests that are justified by a particular condition. Limits on the appropriate length of a hospital stay. On whether a surgical procedure is called for. On how many specialists need to be consulted. That's where the notion of managed care comes in. And in theory, it ought to be possible to set general standards of treatment for any given physical ailment. It won't satisfy everyone, but it's better than no care at all. And it ought to be possible to reach a reasonable conclusion as to when a patient is well enough not to need any further treatment. Granted, even with physical ailments, there can be disagreements and ambiguity. But how do you apply similar standards to the treatment of psychological illness? At what point does someone clearly need supervision and hospitalization? Who decides when a patient has had sufficient psychotherapy? And since drug therapy tends to be a lot cheaper than an open-ended series of visits to a psychiatrist, who decides when one course of treatment is preferable to the other? After all, as Nightline correspondent Dave Marish discovered when reporting this story, those are tough questions to answer when your illness is all in your mind.
Want a spoon or a fork? I began to have suicidal feelings, and it became very obvious that I required more care than, one visit a week or something. My plan only allows one visit per week.
Nancy Armstrong is a long-term mental health patient, but she says her managed care company's insistence on cutting corners has set back her recovery. Once during a suicidal crisis, she tried to have herself admitted to a mental hospital. After waiting for 6 hours, she was admitted, but she says only for the shortest term care.
Initially, it was a day-by-day thing. Each day I was told that the insurance company approved that I would stay that day.
Just for one more day.
And yet, I hadn't even seen the psychiatrist yet.
Even after treatment at McLean Hospital outside Boston had commenced, Nancy says she had no assurance of long-term therapy. Rather, she says she faced the threat of being sent home every day.
Each time I was told I was going, each time I just would become dysfunctional again, and each time then somehow they would pull it out of the hat that I was staying. But this happened all the way to the day I left.
Not long after she was released from the hospital, her managed care company informed Nancy that all her annual mental health benefits for that year had been exhausted.
So I had to leave therapy. And I left therapy, and I did have a breakdown while I was out of therapy.
You've got to thread the needle in order to get treatment. So
Bryant Welch, a clinical psychologist and attorney, represents Nancy.
In one sense, it is all a question of judgment, the judgment of a trained therapist to say when a patient has received adequate treatment, and the judgment of a managed care executive to set guidelines to bring costs under control. Dave Marish continues his report.
You could make the argument that nearly everybody in an entire population would benefit from accessing their mental health benefit and for staying in therapy, sometimes for long periods of time.
Keith Dixon says the key to successful managed mental health care is providing exactly the level of care that an employer wants to pay for.
However, if the employer says, no, we can't afford that type of care, we really want to use this benefit primarily for those who have a diagnosable mental illness with a clear course and with some specific treatment goals, then those are our marching orders.
We were vacationing near Hyannis, and he got up in the middle of the night.
There was no warning, says Boston-based financial consultant Maria Lewis Kusmal, of the mental illness that struck her husband.
He was basically looking through a phone book to look for suicide hotlines.
But she says from the moment her managed care company, Harvard Community Health Plan, got Jim into a hospital, their fixation was on getting him out, even if that meant skimping on treatment of her husband's problems.
After what was like 10 days of inpatient treatment, 4 to 6 weeks of outpatient treatment, the then sort of ongoing psychiatric professional, the HMO's primary care doctor from a mental health standpoint, then sat us down and said, you know, well, Mr. and Mrs. Lewis, you know, we want you to understand that, you know, Harvard doesn't really provide kind of ongoing emotional support therapy. So we really advise that you find yourself a private psychiatrist.
Harvard Community Health Plan not only didn't offer continuing therapy, Maria says it didn't offer to readmit Jim to a hospital when he had another crisis.
It was obvious to me that my husband was deteriorating. That weekend, I drove him to the emergency room of the Harvard-approved facility. They wouldn't admit him because, you know, he didn't look serious enough.
Eventually, Maria got Jim admitted to a mental hospital for a second time, but he was soon discharged again and returned again to a regime of medications and whatever psychiatric care the Lewises could pay for on their own. This combination failed, and in December 1993, Jim Lewis took his own life.
He had had a very hard time ever since his father